Thank you very, very much. I think also a very, very hearty welcome to Minister Sarveen Chowdhury, the Minister for Urbanization, Town and Country Planning and Housing in Himachal Pradesh state in India. Thank you and most welcome to you and your delegation. Ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends, thank you very much for the opportunity of engaging with you on the question of building just cities. Exactly a week ago, almost to the hour, I was presiding over the opening session of the second South African Urban Conference. That urban conference brought together over 350 participants from government at all levels, national, provincial and local, as well as labor, business, civil society, academics and researchers, and traditional leaders. The theme of the conference was activating an all-of-society approach to implementing the urban agenda. So much as I am going to touch upon multi-level government, I think more importantly, I'm going to focus on the importance of a whole-of-government and whole-of-society approach to dealing with urbanization and spatial transformation. President Cyril Ramaphosa was abroad during that conference, but he is someone who is extremely, extremely passionate about the management of urbanization and in particular about spatial transformation. So he sent a message of support, and I want to read a part of that message of support because I think it applies as much to this gathering as it did to that conference. He says, "I greet you and I thank you for responding with such speed and enthusiasm to the call I made in Parliament on the 22nd of August this year that, quote, to build the cities and towns that we want, it is critical that government, the private sector and NGOs work together to create a sustainable growth model for compact, connected, coordinated urban areas by integrating and aligning investments. This should form part of the broader social compact envisaged in the National Development Plan and which in many different ways and on many different fronts we are working to build. Through such a compact, through the transformation of our urban spaces, by strengthening property rights for all, we can ensure that the poor and working class live in decent communities located near to economic opportunities and that parents can return home from work long before their children need to go to sleep," close quote. In Parliament, President Ramaphosa said in August of this year that, and again I quote, "The urban spatial patterns that we inherited from apartheid and which persist to this day contribute to the reproduction of poverty and inequality and must be fundamentally changed. It is unacceptable that the working class and poor, who are overwhelmingly black, are located far from work opportunities and amenities. Among other things, this places enormous pressure on family life. Working parents leave home early and return well after young children are or should be asleep. These long commuting times impact disproportionately on the household income of the poor. According to Stats SA, more than 2/3 of households in the lowest income quintile spend more than 20% of their monthly household income per capita on public transport. But the progressive transformation of our urban spaces is not just about radically addressing social poverty and racial inequalities. We must make our cities generators of wealth and reservoirs of productivity. We need to eradicate the economic inefficiencies of transporting a workforce from dormitory townships into centers. The radical transformation of our urban areas is therefore both a social and an economic imperative. Through instruments like the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act and the Integrated Urban Development Framework, we are approaching spatial planning guided by principles of social equity and economic efficiency. Economic inefficiency is what we have in abundance." Close quote. President Ramaphosa was articulating our national commitment to just cities through the radical social and economic transformation of our urban spaces. Edward Soja in a note, I think that he delivered at a conference around 2008, before he actually published Spatial Justice, defines spatial justice and by extension spatial injustice as, quote, an intentional and focused emphasis on the spatial or geographic aspects of justice and injustice. As a starting point, this involves the fair and equitable distribution in space of socially valued resources and the opportunities to use them, close quote. He argues that spatial justice is not a different kind of justice, divorced from social or economic justice, but rather that it is an important way of looking at justice, and that there is a dynamic, reciprocal relationship between justice and geography. What he terms, quote, the political organization of space, close quote, is identified as a particularly powerful source of spatial injustice, of which apartheid is a striking example. He hastens to add, though, that, quote, the normal workings of an urban system and the attendant, quote, accumulation of locational decisions, close quote, in a capitalist economy are the prime source of injustice in favoring the rich over the poor, aggravated by other forms of spatial and locational discrimination based on racism, patriarchy, heterosexual bias, etc. South Africa's National Development Plan Vision 2030 recognizes the interlinked realities of the persistence of colonial and apartheid spatial patterns and the very rapid urbanization that the country is undergoing. Already 2/3 of South Africans are living in urban areas, and by 2050 that is projected to reach 80%. Realistically, it asserts that there are no quick fixes for transforming the functioning of human settlements and the workings of the space economy. It recognizes that there are powerful interests concerned with maintaining the spatial status quo, while the massive existing investment in fixed assets means that transformation will invariably be incremental. It expresses confidence, however, that bold measures taken over a sustained period could change the trajectories of spatial development and could mean considerable gains for ordinary citizens and for the national economy. Reshaping of colonial and apartheid geography may take decades. By 2030, South Africa should observe meaningful and measurable progress in reviving rural areas and in creating more functionally integrated, balanced and vibrant urban settlements. However, the National Development Plan goes on to say that we need to do three things if we're going to achieve that goal. Firstly, we need to clarify and relentlessly pursue a national vision for spatial development. Open the instruments for achieving this vision. And thirdly, we must build the required capabilities in the state and among citizens. So as part of clarifying a national vision for spatial development, the NDP sets out overarching principles to which all spatial development should conform. Firstly, spatial justice. The historic policy of confining particular groups to limited space, as in ghettoization and segregation, and the unfair allocation of public resources between areas must be reversed to ensure that the needs of the poor are addressed first rather than last. Secondly, spatial sustainability. Sustainable patterns of consumption and production should be supported, and ways of living promoted that do not damage the natural environment. Thirdly, spatial resilience. Vulnerability to environmental degradation, resource scarcity, and climatic shocks must be reduced. Ecological systems should be protected and replenished. Fourthly, spatial quality. The aesthetic and functional features of housing and the built environment need to be improved to create livable, vibrant, and valued places that allow for access and inclusion of people with disabilities. 5, spatial efficiency. Productive activity and jobs should be supported and burdens on businesses minimized. Efficient commuting patterns and circulation of goods and services should be encouraged with regulatory procedures that do not impose unnecessary costs on development. These are the principles that inform our Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, as well as the National Spatial Development Framework that is currently being developed, led by the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform. These are also the principles that inform South Africa's Integrated Urban Development Framework, adopted by Cabinet on the 27th of April 2016 and announced the very next day on the 27th of April, which is South African Freedom Day. After a 4-year process of development and consultation. The IUDF is one of the sharp instruments that the NDP calls for. It's consistent with SDG 11, with the new Urban Agenda, with the Paris Climate Agreements and the Sendai Framework. It marks a new deal for South Africa's cities and towns, steering urban growth towards a sustainable model of compact, connected and coordinated cities and towns. It recognizes that the country has different types of cities and towns with different roles and requirements, and that the IUDF must be interpreted and pursued in differentiated, locally relevant ways. The IUDF's premise is that jobs, housing and transport should be used to promote urban restructuring as outlined in the NDP. The objective is to transform urban spaces by doing 5 things: and distances. Secondly, preventing further development of housing in marginal places. Thirdly, increasing urban densities to reduce sprawl. Fourthly, improving public transport and the coordination between transport modes. And fifth, shifting jobs and investment towards dense peripheral townships. The IUDF provides key principles and policy levers for creating urban spaces. The 9 policy levers and priorities are premised on an understanding that integrated urban planning forms the basis for achieving integrated urban development, which follows a specific sequence of urban policy actions. Integrated transport informs targeted investments into integrated human settlements and should be underpinned by integrated infrastructure, network systems, and efficient land governance. Together, these trigger economic diversification and inclusion and the creation of empowered communities, which in turn will demand deep governance and financial reform. The levers in combination address the structural drivers that promote the status quo and bring the different sectors together to work towards creating compact, connected, and coordinated cities and towns. Furthermore, and I think this is a very, very important furthermore, the identified priorities should strengthen urban-rural linkages, promote urban resilience, and create safe urban spaces to ensure that the needs of the most vulnerable groups are addressed. I think it's a very, very important point, especially the linkage between urban and rural areas. South Africa is not, the IUDF is not the first urban policy that South Africa has had. Many others have run on the rocks, exactly through a careless handling of the urban-rural dynamic. And the IUDF makes and the NDP make the point very, very clear that we're talking about an urban continuum. We need to strengthen the links between urban and rural areas, and that in fact, in a South African context, what exactly constitutes urban and what constitutes rural very often is very, very vague. There are rural areas, including areas that fall under the traditional authorities, that are undergoing densification and assuming urban characteristics extremely rapidly. Conversely, there are areas that are generally regarded as urban, even metropolitan, such as eThekwini, that in fact have a majority, or a lion's share of their territory that would be classified traditionally as rural. Combined with that, we still have the legacy of apartheid, migrant labor policies, and circular migration patterns between urban and rural areas. So I think it's a very, very important point that when we talk about rural development, urban development, we're talking about rural development walking hand in hand with urban development. The IUDF has sought to provide a roadmap to follow in the national quest for spatial transformation towards livable, inclusive, and resilient towns and cities. It's an all-encompassing policy to guide current and future growth. The IUDF is adopted as a learning policy framework, and the priorities in the action plan will be regularly reviewed as we continue to learn from practice. It's intended to be used by all spheres of government and all sectors, private sector, civil society, and all stakeholders concerned with urban growth and urban futures. Indeed, an active citizenry is critical for creating socially cohesive and integrated communities, and so municipalities should prioritize measures to enable communities to shape their own spaces, the energy and the investment of their citizens. In fact, the very power of cities stems from their unique capacity to bring together a critical mass of social and cultural diversity. Empowering residents to participate in local government results in active citizenry and social inclusion, cohesion and integration. That social integration is imperative, especially in the South African context of an unjust history, a legacy of urbanization of South Africa that has been exclusionary rather than inclusionary. Empowered and active communities are critical for achieving other aspects of the IUDF, such as integrated urban planning and management, sustainable human settlements, urban infrastructure and inclusive economic development, and effective urban governance. The IUDF recognizes that despite the emphasis placed on public participation in the Constitution, in the White Paper on Local Government, and various other local government statutes, public participation in many cases has become overly routine in planning processes and does not cultivate constructive, mutually supportive initiatives. People are, in fact, not always placed at the center of processes and empowered to be architects of their own lives through participating in planning, designing, and managing their spaces. The IUDF recognizes that on the positive side, government is already deeply committed to the co-production of various services at local level through structures such as ward committees, community policing fora, parent-teacher associations, school governing bodies, community health committees, and home-based care committees and programs such as the Community Work Program. It also recognizes that community fora, community and faith-based organizations are structures that could play an important role. However, it identifies the following 5 challenges to greater public participation in the designing and the running of our urban spaces. Firstly, insufficient skills and experience within both government or in government to engage with civil society. Secondly, the lack of innovative co-produced solutions to service delivery. The current service delivery model whereby government provides all the services is both socially and fiscally unviable and does not encourage the co-production of innovative solutions. To an extent, it is the unintended consequence of how some policies have been interpreted and applied. 3, the lack of understanding of government structures and operations. Fourthly, the inadequate use of fora to promote participation and social cohesion. And 5th, inadequate provision of quality public spaces. Municipalities display limited internal capacity to engage meaningfully with communities. Existing structures are hampered by poor management skills, internal conflicts, limited resources, and government officials' lack of capacity to work sensitively with community members, and most importantly, disillusionment among communities because of limited results achieved. The revised system should encourage engagements at a neighborhood, not necessarily at a ward level, and use existing relevant community platforms. Citizens should be involved in planning, designing, and managing their neighborhoods. In accordance with the NDP, government should engage with people in their own fora, rather than in fora created by the state. Government should assist in establishing community-created fora that bring together stakeholders to share, understand, and learn from each other, thereby promoting social learning. Local communities can also benefit from the skills and enterprise and networks of new arrivals, which would reduce xenophobia and migrant exclusion. Furthermore, special mechanisms should be developed to enable vulnerable groups to participate, particularly the illiterate, blind, hearing impaired, and outsiders in communities. It proposes that in the short to medium term, the following steps should be taken. Firstly, to invest in people's capabilities. Citizenship education and training in planning, project management, and budget, institutional and spatial literacy is needed to strengthen community organizations. That last aspect around spatial literacy is something that we are starting to tackle as a joint project with the Municipal Demarcation Board. And I think it's a very, very important one, and I think it's an organization such as Mistra would be ideally suited to help in that regard. Spatial literacy, not only amongst citizens, but in many cases amongst officials in government as well, is sorely lacking. Community activists and workers should be equipped with skills in community organization, management, and planning. This will enable effective engagement with the broader municipal planning systems. Secondly, build institutional capacity to engage. Multi-stakeholder processes are complex and require particular facilitation skills. This means that capacity building within government should not be limited to the units or sections responsible for coordinating public participation or stakeholder engagement, but should be mainstreamed in all departments. This will require relationships with relevant NGOs and academic institutions. Thirdly, we must explore co-production mechanisms to find solutions to service delivery challenges. Government generally and municipalities in particular need to rethink service delivery business models and value chains in order to work in dynamic ways with citizens and their organizations. Fourthly, we need to improve access to quality public infrastructure and facilities. Municipalities should provide quality, safe spaces where citizens feel valued, that complement public transport and other basic services that contribute to creating safe and sustainable human settlements. Investments should also be made in cultural and social infrastructure that promotes the mixing of different groups, while urban design should provide safe and quality spaces for families and individuals from different cultures, races, and genders to interact. Community and faith-based organizations are critical for building social cohesion and integration. Government should also provide goods and services that help migrants to integrate into the city. Most migrants to cities are vulnerable, and tensions may arise because of perceived competition for resources. Helping migrants to integrate will require stronger intergovernmental collaboration because the functions critical for integration are divided amongst national, provincial, and local government. Fourthly, ensure effective leadership at local level. Leadership, both city and civic, is critical for social transformation. In order to promote accountability and transparency, leaders should engage communities on municipal issues such as budget, projects, and general information. Political representatives and administrative leaders should have clear programs for engaging residents guided by the relevant legislative and policy prescripts. Civic leaders should also help work with cities to drive an agenda of values and inclusion of the most vulnerable groups. In the long term, the IUDF and the NDP call for the formulation of spatial social compacts. The NDP argues that the transformation of space is complex given the diversity across South Africa, the entrenched historical legacies, the multiple interests at stake, and the many trade-offs required. It supports developing social compacts as a way of mediating interests and providing the platform for future action. It suggests that these compacts may be developed in a variety of sectors such as health, education, the economy, but can also have, and in fact must have, a spatial dimension. It proposes that spatial compacts can happen at various scales from neighborhoods to cities and regions. They must deal with matters of direct concern where there are competing interests, such as the development of new public transport systems, the upgrading of informal settlements, the management of informal trading, inner city regeneration, neighborhood safety, measures towards environmental sustainability, and infrastructure maintenance. These compacts should be managed to give voice to all competing interests and should address the responsibilities of the state, the private sector, and citizenry in spatial development. The government should find means to incentivize the development of these compacts. Developing social or spatial compacts has preconditions, such as a level of trust between participants, high-level mediation capacity, measures to ensure equitable participation, especially where some parties are well-resourced and others are not, and adequate sanctions and consequences of non-performance in terms of the contract. Strong capacity is required to initiate the process to draft and to oversee the implementation of the compact. Recently I addressed a conference on state capture and its aftermath, building responsiveness through state reform. I argued that spatial transformation requires a capable, democratic, developmental state, able to lead government, business, civil society, and that it is vital for the state not to be captured or to be perceived to be captured by any narrow sectional interest, so that it can maintain what Joel Netshitenze calls or describes as an appropriate balance between embeddedness and autonomy, between insulation and connectedness, that is critical for the ability of any developmental state to inject strategic vision within society and to keep those different, often divergent interests marshaled together. In my input, I made the point that the capture of institutions in municipalities dealing with land and development permission processes hold the promise of far more treasures to loot than those dealing with supply chain management, and with consequences that will be even more devastating in the long term because they will literally be cast in concrete. I also referred to the fact that following his very insightful book on state capture in the Nelson Mandela Metro titled How to Steal a City, Dr. Crispian Olver has turned his attention to investigating the manipulation, if not outright capture, of land and development permission processes in various municipalities. Tellingly, the City of Cape Town has refused Dr. Olver access to even basic documents. I don't know whether the organizers of this conference organized it, but the headline in this morning's Cape Times is, quote, "City slammed for apartheid spatial planning. Activists outraged by exclusive development." The article reads, quote, "Activists advocating for affordable housing in the central business district say the city has once again missed an opportunity to address spatial planning after it dismissed an application for inclusive housing at the old Christian Barnard building," close quote. One of the activists, Jared Rousseau, said, quote, "We can only imagine that councillors do not want to disrupt the business as usual approach, which has become entrenched, where developers secure extra rights to build bigger and higher, earning massive windfalls for their shareholders. We're simply asking the city to comply with the law and to do everything in its powers to ensure that we build an inclusive city for generations to come, rather than a playground for the rich," close quote. These matters, and I don't want to be misunderstood, the questions of spatial transformation are inherently political. So whenever we talk about them, we talk politics. I think we need to be honest about that. What I don't want to be misinterpreted is taking cheap, narrow party political shots, because whatever I'm saying about Cape Town would apply just as much to any number of municipalities under a wide variety of political control. But I think it is telling that these matters seem to lie at the heart of the political instability besetting the Cape Town Metro, as evinced by the resignation of former Mayor Patricia de Lille and 9 other members of the Democratic Alliance last week. Earlier in the year, Natasha Mariam wrote in Business Day that, quote, "De Lille claims that her woes began in 2014 when she presented a document on transforming the spatial landscape of the city of Cape Town. She says her agenda would have done away with the apartheid spatial planning in the city and would have begun to develop it as a truly inclusive place to live," close quote. Mariam argues that the facts show that there is a real pushback against a truly transformative agenda in the DA, and the woke South African illiterate can see right through it, quote, close quote. I think these extracts take us then back to the points made earlier by Edward Soja, and point to a convergence of, on the one hand, the, quote, political organization of space, and on the other hand, quote, the accumulation of locational decisions arising from the normal workings of an urban system under capitalism. Now, as I said, I think, and this is, I don't know, how much am I still in time? Am I way over time?
We've got another few minutes.
Is it? Okay. Because you're going to have to stop me, because I'll carry on. Addressing a conference on the death penalty at the Vatican in Italy. And I got there a bit late and went straight in and addressed. So I was talking and I was holding forth because in a past life I'd worked at an organization called Lawyers for Human Rights and worked specifically on the death penalty when South Africa still had that terrible thing. So I was holding forth about how, 20 years into democracy, South Africa has 16,000 murders, whilst under apartheid with the death penalty we had 32,000, and I was really getting enthused, and the priest who was cheering was going like this. And I thought he was saying, you see there? You see there? In the meantime, he was saying, wrap up. So when you start doing that, I'll get the message. I raised the last points exactly because it goes to the heart of the question of how a developmental state, both nationally, provincially, and most importantly locally, needs to have both the integrity and the credibility to bring together different sectors of society, different social partners. At the same time, it must have the technical capability of engaging meaningfully with those social partners. And it can only do so if it doesn't become captured by one of those or more of those sectors. And conversely, it can only avoid capture if it does have that robust capability. And in terms of local government, we're not in a great space. A few years ago, we did a very thorough evaluation of all 257 of our municipalities. It was slightly more then, but... And we did that based on about 25 different set criteria. Basic service delivery, governance, financial management, citizen satisfaction, incidents of protest, etc., etc. And we came to the conclusion that 1/3 of our municipalities were functioning well, and in some cases excellently. And we think it's important that we highlight that, because local government is not the big morass of incompetence and corruption that it's often painted to be. There are examples of real innovation and excellence and extremely dedicated councillors and officials. There's 1/3 of our municipalities that are doing well, that are getting many of the basics right, but they have challenges. And if we don't help them with those challenges, they can slide into dysfunctionality. And 1/3 of our municipalities, we came to the conclusion, are just dysfunctional. Of that dysfunctionality, broadly speaking, we can say on the one hand would be structural and systemic. We've moved from a system of 1,200 disparate apartheid-era local government entities, white town councils, black local authorities, homeland structures. We've consolidated all of that into a wall-to-wall system of 257 municipalities. Many of those municipalities cover those former homeland areas, vast rural areas, very little economic activity, very little revenue base, high levels of grant dependency, inability to attract suitably experienced and qualified officials. On the other hand, there are amongst those dysfunctional municipalities that objectively speaking should be well functioning. But through a breakdown in governance, most often caused by a contestation over access to state resources, then leads to a complete breakdown in governance, in financial management, and ultimately in service delivery. So you sit then with a very complex set of interventions that need to be very, very carefully coordinated if you're going to turn those municipalities around. On the one hand, you need to intervene as government, technically, and we've put in place district support teams consisting of engineers, of financial and governance experts, town and regional planners, that are focusing on 57 out of those 87 dysfunctional municipalities, to help build that capacity that they need to get things right, to spend the municipal infrastructure grants that they get from national government. But if that's not complemented by a concomitant series of political interventions, and often party political interventions, to sort out the underlying causes, those governmental interventions will also have a limited effect. And we've seen that in a number of municipalities where we have been successful. Nelson Mandela Bay, Oudtshoorn, Mogalakwena, all of those were characterized by well-coordinated governmental and political interventions. The second area that's of great importance is getting national government its own house in order. In very many instances, national departments themselves are not talking to each other. And they descend into the municipal space in a completely disjointed and uncoordinated way, sometimes causing chaos and havoc through uncoordinated, well-intentioned, albeit uncoordinated interventions. Secondly, the uncoordinated nature of those service delivery interventions often blunt the full impact that the deployment of those resources could have. At best. At worst, it holds back the cause of social transformation. I've been to municipalities where the IUDF is being piloted, and you find a national initiative like an industrial development zone in one corner of the municipality, a 10,000 unit human settlements project, 20, 30 kilometers away, with no obvious sign of how those two are going to be linked through public transport, let alone the provision of schools, of parks, of police stations, of clinics to that human settlement project. So under the leadership of the Minister of Cogta, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, the interministerial task team on basic service delivery is trying to get those core departments to come together, to put their programs, to put their budgets on the table, and to geo-map those, to make sure that there's at least some semblance of integration, of cohesion, coordination, and proper sequencing of those projects. Because often also what happens is that even if you get the space question right, and you mess up the time and the sequencing, you end up with a human settlement that's of 5,000 units standing there empty, because you haven't planned for it to be connected to water or electricity at the right time. I've witnessed a state-of-the-art police station that must have cost a couple of R100 million standing empty for 2.5 years. Everything in place, except the connection to bulk sanitation. So it's that level of planning and coordination at a national level, a more effective use of our intergovernmental relations machinery to make sure that national, provincial, and local government work, plan, and implement in harmony. And I think ultimately there are some searching long-term policy and structural issues that we need also to grapple with, and how we've allocated powers and functions across the three spheres of government, whether that is an optimal distribution of powers and functions, also whether the wall-to-wall model of municipalities is necessarily an optimal one. And also within that, the question of the relationship between district and local municipalities, how you distribute the powers and functions amongst them, are some of the issues that currently are being reviewed with a view to reworking those things in a next term. So, Thank you very much again for the opportunity. I hope that those thoughts have made some contribution. Thanks.